Between May and September of 1787, 55 representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After 4 months of arguing and debating, Constitution that serves as the foundation of the United States were hammered out. Specifically, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted slaves as three-fifths of a person for the purpose of taxes and number of representatives, was reached out in favor of those slaveholders. As we look back at the history, a simple question arises: did the compromise reduce or actually increase conflict in the U.S. history? Founding fathers willed the political compromise, which gave slaveholding states an advantage in House of Representatives, necessary in building the Constitution. In Federalist Paper No. 54, Madison defended the clauses in the Constitution that claimed slaves as three-fifths of a person. Madison asserted that it was a compromise expedient necessary to pass a constitution acceptable to all states. However, from sources connected to those founding fathers, it is pretty clear that even people who proposed this Three-Fifths Compromise opposed slavery. According to James Madison, African Americans had little distinction with them, Anglo-Saxon Americans, which means there were no justifications for them to enslave blacks. Even George Washington expressed his expectation towards the abolition of slavery in the future. In the long run, the Constitution's failure to create principles of racial equality resulted in violence down the line, leading up to the Civil War. The mainland expansion of the U.S. after the American Revolution had facilitated the hostility between pro-slavery and anti-slavery states over the extension of slavery to the new territories, as the Three-Fifths Compromise allowed the existence of slavery. Once compromises could no longer alleviate this contradiction, the most catastrophic war, Civil War, broke out, which took away 620,000 people's lives. The influence of the compromise was not limited to the outbreak of Civil War, but also the circumstances African Americans faced later on and relationships between blacks and whites. Before the Civil War, because of the invention of new agricultural tools such as cotton gin, the demand for slaves working on plantations greatly increased, which resulted in greater number of slaves. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1851 gained wide popularity, particularly in northern states where anti-slavery sentiments ran high. 300,000 copies of the book were sold. It vividly depicted the suffering experience of slaves and how slaveholders mistreated them. Regarding Abraham Lincoln's greeting when he first met Story in 1862, the impact of the book was very large, even though Lincoln may have exaggerated the significance of it. The compromise legalized the inequality between blacks and whites that resulted in cultural inferiority of blacks. Slaves began to own legal citizenship following the announcement of Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. However, by and large, rights of African Americans were limited by whites using various methods. From the era of Reconstruction to Roaring Twenties, African Americans suffered from white Americans' oppressions, particularly through Jim Crow laws and racial segregation in the South. By practicing the separate but equal theory under these laws, African Americans had to suffer from inferior status and facilities, such as suffering from separate schools, buses, hospitals, and restaurants, etc. The growth of the Ku Klux Klan, a West organization in pursuit of the white supremacy, even worsened the life of blacks. Klan members' attempts involved intimidation, lynching, and other violent activities toward newly enfranchised black freedmen. Police officers turned a blind eye, and some even joined KKK. In addition, they greatly suffered from the economic inequality and educational inequality in the 19th and 20th century. Blacks were still cheap labor and exploited by employers under the wage labor system, with few differences before emancipation. Few schools and teachers were available for blacks. Even today, average incomes of blacks were much lower than whites. During 1950s and 1960s, when global civil rights movements were privileged, many took place in the United States for blacks' equal rights as well. The The March on Washington in 1963 took place peacefully, whereas dozens of black protesters collided with police and got injured in the Selma to Montgomery March, protesting the killing of a black civil rights activist by a white police officer.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The influence of the compromise was long-lasting and contributed to the conflicts between races after modern war. More radically, it was argued that the compromise was even unnecessary, as it undermined the morality of the society and allowed the continuation of slavery. According to Governor Morris, Northern and Southern states should take a friendly leave of each other rather than incompatibly integrating together. He suggested Southerners would probably choose to form their own nation and import slaves continuously until they were overwhelmed and turned down by black slaves. To summarize, for the needs under specific political circumstances, the swift compromise was significant in resolving Southern concerns temporarily, but it is also obvious about its long-lasting political and social impacts, which provoked several strifes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery states, as well as violence among blacks and whites due to its failure on creating principles of racial equality. To build a political compromise alleviate Southern concerns, the ethical underpinnings of the Constitution were undermined and resulted in more violence throughout history, since it gives Southerners political muscle to implement the other classes and protect the middle class of the South.